At a hero auction, where various kingdoms and empires can bid on and purchase heroes, Suka, whose job as a C-rank cook, is put on sale. Unfortunately, he can't exactly cook a demon lord to death. Nobody is the least bit interested in him, and the room is openly hostile. During a home economics class, he prepares an entire set menu all by himself, but the response from his group mates is rather lukewarm. Suka isn't discouraged by this, since he knows that his online friends would have been more impressed. Fortunately, another student, Suzuno, sees what Suka has prepared and praises him for it. She jokes that she's far too clumsy in the kitchen and that her group mates actually asked her to touch absolutely nothing. Their teacher excuses herself for a few minutes, and she warns them to simply be careful of the open flames on the stoves. For some reason, Suka has a feeling that something is about to happen. That something happens. A bright light fills the room, forcing everyone to cover their eyes. A moment later, they find themselves in a large hall, and Suka realizes that this must be the famous isekai trope he's heard about. He sure hopes that the series he's in doesn't have 50 chapters. Everyone spends a few minutes scrambling in search of answers, but they are quickly surrounded by men in robes. A man on the balcony introduces himself and his compatriots as representatives of the United Kingdoms. The man explains that they have all been summoned here as heroes as part of their ritual. A few knights body check a few unruly students in place. They are all asked to touch a special nameplate, which will contain information regarding their job titles and base value. All heroes that have been summoned will be delivered to one of the 9 kingdoms within the United Kingdoms. Their mission is the same in each one, to stop the local demon king in each area from wreaking havoc. When it is Suzuno's turn to place her hand on the nameplate, her job title is revealed to be the Holy Maiden, rank S. Her initial price is set at 5 million, but the bids quickly double, triple, and quadruple in price. She is eventually auctioned off for a whopping 55 million gold. When it is Suka's turn to be auctioned off, his job as cook is met with jeers instead of cheers. The gallery becomes agitated, and they demand that Suka be taken off the stand immediately. As a result, Suka is escorted out of the auction hall and given a sword and a small loan of a few hundred gold to survive for a while. He is then told to enter through a teleportation gate, which will transport him to a random country in the world. This is the next best thing they can do. Ichinos calls out to Suka and asks if they will see each other again someday. He tells her that, if they're lucky, they'll meet again someday. After seeing her off, Suka steps through the door, but when he hesitates, the man pushes him into it instead. Suka stumbles into an unfamiliar forest while the portal gate behind him closes. Suka realizes that he'd been tricked. He wasn't transported to another country at all. He has been teleported to the Bolf Forest, a widely uninhabited and mostly inhospitable wilderness. Suka picks up the status plate given to him, which details the specifics of his stats. As expected of his job class, his main skill is cooking. At the very least, his skills will help him survive better than most. Suka begins using his skills to forage around the forest for edible materials. Thanks to his cut skill, he can also instantly prepare anything he harvests. He hears some leaves and branches rustle behind him, and when he sees a rat poke its head out, he quickly draws his sword to prepare for combat. However, due to his middling stat spread, he is unable to properly wield the sword, and he is forced to drop it. He blames the United Kingdoms for dropping him in such a dangerous forest, and he swears revenge. But the rat is the least of his worries. A large saber-toothed leopard cat emerges from the bushes. Suka thinks it is a cat at first, but he quickly realizes it is nearly gigantic. He runs away as fast as he can, and he desperately tries to find a weapon in his inventory to use. Unless the leopard has a crippling fear of mushrooms, Suka is out of luck. The leopard manages to swipe Suka, causing a nasty gash in his abdomen. He begins bleeding out, and he wonders if his revenge story will end here. He doesn't want to die yet. Out of desperation, he repeatedly uses the only offensive skill in his arsenal, Ignite. The leopard is set ablaze, and the flames prove to be too much for it to handle. However, it manages to gain a moment of clarity, and it tries to kill Suka to put an end to the flames. Suka uses his other skill, Dismantle, in the hopes that it does something. And boy, does it do something. The leopard just straight up dies. It disappears into thin air. It looks like the mods forgot to patch this skill. Suka's victory over the leopard grants him a burst of experience points, and he rapidly levels up. After lying motionless for what seems like an eternity, Suka manages to regain consciousness. He is on the ground, bleeding and badly injured, but he is alive. He uses one of his new skills, Water Gun, to give himself a much-needed drink. He then uses another skill, Healing Food, to conjure a steak made out of leopard meat right out of thin air. Suka crawls toward the medium-well steak and eats it. He swallows it and nourishment fills his body. His wounds quickly heal and his condition stabilizes. He can hardly believe it himself. He's alive and thriving. There's hope for him yet. Suka is now level 123. His notable stats are dexterity and luck, both of which are at EX. This is what happens when you let him cook. While wandering through the forest, Suka spots a level 200 Sword Reaper from afar, but he finds it unlikely that he could beat him. Instead, he decides to chill out by using his cooking ability to conjure up a steak anytime he wants. I'm definitely wishing for this if I ever find a Jinni. He notices that his steak grants him an effect when he eats it. His suspicions are confirmed when he makes several more steaks, each of which grants similar stacking passive bonus effects. He understands now the strength of his power. The more monster meat he eats, the more power he'll get. Suka gradually improves his power by attacking monsters and turning their meat into meals that grant him more and more bonus effects. However, he runs into a roadblock when he stumbles upon a pack of level 150 hyena wolves. Unable to fight any of them one-on-one, he chooses to safely use his water gun spell from atop a tree branch. This does little more than give them a bath, however. Suddenly, a bear snaps up one of the wolves with its gigantic jaws. Suka can feel himself breaking out into a nervous sweat. It is a gigantic level 210 hell bear. The bear's roar is loud enough to reverberate through the air, which is enough to cause physical damage. Suka falls from the tree, and as he falls, he desperately uses another water gun spell to temporarily stun the bear. He rolls out of the way and uses two other spells in his arsenal, Wood Magic and Shadow Binding, to hinder its movements, but this is only a temporary measure. Suka tries to use his throwing skill in the hopes that a rock would magically be enough to kill it, but it only makes the bear angrier. The hell bear breaks free of its bonds and charges right into Suka before he can attempt to use Ignite. He has the wind knocked out of him, and he is thrown into the air. The bear uses its massive claws to pierce Suka's organs, mortally wounding him. Suka's vision goes dark, and for the second time this week, he is at death's door. Still, he remains unsatisfied and restless that he wasn't able to attain the revenge he so desperately craves. He gives it one last shot, and he tries using his dismantle skill by simply thinking of it. Just like the leopard from before, the bear simply explodes into chunks of bear meat. It makes you wonder why he didn't just do this from the start. Suka's life is saved yet again by the rapid level ups he receives. He prepares 4 different steaks out of the bear's meat, all of which augment his physical attributes. His fight with the beast was a little too close for comfort, and Suka makes sure to be extra careful from now on. A leopard discovers him surrounded by meat, and it looks terribly hungry. Suka is forced to use Dismantle to kill it again, but he hates using it. Suka is a showman. He wants to win without depending on the absolutely broken Dismantle ability. He wants to be clever. While eating the leopard steaks, he discovers that one of them had a dark magic skill, and he is ecstatic to finally attain a more sinister skill, something suited for his quest for revenge. Unfortunately, the only skill he gets is Pervert, which grants him the ability to walk around without any clothes on. I'm not sure if you can call that an ability though. A month has passed since Suka was first brought into the world. In that short time span, his level exploded to level 205, with dozens of passive skills at his disposal. He's become strong for sure, but he still doesn't know when he'll ever make it out of the forest, much less find civilization again. He knows that in most isekai tropes like this, the main character usually has a traveling companion. Suka is now battling a more powerful foe, loneliness. He can't just dismantle that. He suddenly senses a familiar presence and spots the Sword Reaper from before. He'd always hidden from it out of fear of being killed, but Suka is confident that he can beat it now. He attempts to restrain it using Shadow Binding, but the Sword Reaper manages to instantly teleport itself a short distance away. Suka sees him in time, and he follows up with Wood Magic to hold him in place. The Sword Reaper is trapped, and it is completely at the mercy of Suka's Ignite. However, the Sword Reaper manages to teleport away again, and Suka uses his Detect skill to figure out the limits of this movement skill. The Sword Reaper is capable of repeatedly teleporting up to 150 meters away. While chasing his prey, Suka suddenly hears the tree branches above him being cut. He jumps out of the way in time, but he ends up rolling right into the Sword Reaper's blade. Suka decides to just finish it off with Dismantle. No showmanship today. Suka takes the Sword Reaper's Hermit's Coat, which grants an invisibility to lower-level monsters and increased protection against all magical attacks. However, when he tries to pick up the sword, a pulse of blue flame causes him to stumble back. The flaming sword speaks, asking Suka if he is a warrior. Suka now has a whole thesis of magical abilities, passes, and skills. His sword, now in a fancy new sheath, is astonished that Suka is able to grant himself skills by cooking. He's never heard of any cooks who can do that. A few hours prior, the sword asks Suka if he is a warrior. The sword will ask a series of questions to determine if Suka is worthy of wielding it in battle. The first thing it asks is if Suka believes in God. Suka snickers at such a ridiculous question. He believes in God, not because he wants to, but because he was essentially forced to. He confides that he never believed in saints or gods before he came to this world. He wouldn't have accepted their existence. However, he was suddenly summoned over to this world against his will. He was mocked, ridiculed, and thrown away like trash. He thought several times he was going to die, but he managed to escape death multiple times through sheer dumb luck and the absurd power levels of his skills. Suka lived in constant fear without clothes to protect himself or shoes to cover his feet. He suffered from terrible insomnia due to his anxiety. Therefore, he took this as proof of God's existence. He believes that the only reason this all happened to him is because a mighty God allowed the possibility of summoning heroes, and it is a God who ignores when his servants act out of line. He believes that all this boils down to him being a product of this ridiculous God. That's why Suka swears to bash God's face in if he ever has the fortune of running into him. The sword laughs, and he finds Suka's single-minded quest for vengeance to be extremely interesting. He allows Suka to wield him Kuro and to change his form into whatever shape he wishes. Back in the present, Suka endures Kuro's rambling, nagging, and chatting. He wonders if the unfathomable power the sword provides is worth all this. He asks Kuro if there are any human settlements nearby, and though Kuro hates to be the bearer of bad news, he regrets to inform him that he is currently smack dab in the center of both forests. In fact, Kuro thought that Suka was going out of his way to fight the forest boss monster, the Emperor Dragon. Suka runs faster than his dad left him. He's never seen something so big and massive in his entire life. Kuro is confused as to why he's running away when he has a powerful sword like him on his hip, but Suka exclaims that he's never even used a sword before in his life. The dragon fires a breath of fire that blasts Suka, leaving behind a visible crater. He is knocked unconscious, and Kuro's cries fall on deaf ears. As the dragon swoops in to snap him up with its jaws, Suka uses his dark magic to slip into the dragon's shadow. The dragon looks from side to side, visibly confused as to where his prey went. Suka uses this opportunity to stuff his face with recovery stakes, and the moment he is back on his feet, he grabs Kuro and grabs away. I'm just as annoyed as Kuro here. At least try to swing the damn sword, you breadloaf. Despite Suka being partially camouflaged thanks to his dark magic, the dragon is still able to accurately aim at him with its fire breath. Try as he might to run away, the dragon is able to sense him and reliably track him down. Faced with another Emperor breath, Suka turns around and erects an iron wall barrier. He barely survives by the skin of his teeth, and after chomping down on more recovery stakes, he slinks back into the shadows beneath the dragon, its only blind spot. Suka's plan is to conceal his presence up until the last moment, and to use Dismantle to kill it instantly. However, the moment he pops out of the shadows, the dragon takes to the skies and uses its tail to knock Suka down to earth. Suka manages to move back into position through his dark magic, but his attack is once again avoided. It's like this dragon has eyes on the back of its head. He braces himself for another attack by augmenting himself with his superhuman strength and iron wall, and he barely survives another Emperor breath. He returns to the shadows with his dark magic, and he avoids detection for as long as he can. Suka is confused as to why the dragon is able to detect him even though he has presence concealment active, and Kuro explains that his murderous intent is too strong. Even though his presence is concealed, his bloodthirst gives him away. Suka goes through his abilities and singles out Fabricate among the other ridiculously long Wikipedia references. He tries his attack again, but this time he changes his murderous intent into love. This time the dragon is unable to detect him, and Suka dismantles him into large chunks of dragon meat cubes. Delicious. Suka stumbles on the last thing he'd expect to see in a dangerous forest, a gotcha ball machine. Kuro tells him that it is meant to help adventurers defeat the forest boss, and he encourages him to try it out. Seeing no harm in it, Suka turns the dial, and a black ball pops out. He opens it, and he is covered in thick smoke. He receives the equivalent exchange skill title, which Kuro excitedly explains is a unique skill. However, Suka isn't satisfied with just this, and he wants more. Kuro says he'll have to work for it. He returns to battling monsters that populate the forest, and he's got a good rhythm going. First he battles the boss, defeats some other monsters, waits for the boss to respawn, and repeats. The steaks he eats made from the fallen monsters grant him even more effects, so much effects that I'm physically getting tired from seeing them on my screen. While Suka relaxes in a hot tub of his own design, Kuro asks him if he really plans to leave the forest in such raggedy, worn-out clothes. Suka acknowledges that his sword has a point, so he does what he should have really done weeks ago: make clothes out of the monster she killed. Using the hyena fur, hellbear pelt, and sleep sheep wool, he creates what is essentially the isekai uniform: a black cloak, black pants, black boots, and a black haircut. I blame Sword Art Online for this. Kuro suggests that he also camouflage the abilities of his equipment so as not to alert anyone that he's actually giga-busted. Suka makes it to the edge of the forest, which happens to be overlooking a shallow river. He ends up tripping and falling over, and Kuro remarks that this is the first time he's ever seen someone mess up looking at a river. Suka hears a commotion about 100 meters away, and judging by the sounds, Kuro guesses that a few bandits are attacking and robbing people. Suka thinks about what he should do for a moment, and he decides to simply disguise himself and walk by without making a fuss. He still doesn't know the full story. For all he knows, the civilians could have been the ones to instigate the whole situation. He cloaks himself and tries to pass by unnoticed, but someone from inside the carriage calls out for his help. Suddenly, a few bandits that had concealed themselves atop the nearby cliff jump down and commandeer the carriage for themselves. Several of them hitch a ride, all while celebrating that they'd caught the princess. Suka sees this happen, and he decides to act after all. In one swift movement, the survivors are left in a state of shock, and they can do little but try to run away. One of them desperately tries to pry open the door, but Suka cuts him down too. Inside the carriage, the princess catches a glimpse of her savior. After a few short moments, Suka lands motionless atop the carriage, while the road behind him has been paved with the bones and bodies of his victims. Kuro asks him how it feels to have killed a person for the first time, and all Suka has to say is that it was too easy. The princess's guards catch up to the carriage, and they try to ask Suka for his name. Without a word, Suka jumps down and leaves, leaving them to speculate on who he was. It will remain a mystery to them for some time. After a long journey, Suka arrives in the city of Algeria, where his isekai story can finally begin in earnest. The princess recounts her encounter with Suka to her father, who looks forward to somehow meeting this person again one day. He purchases a few ingredients and food, but he thinks poorly of the quality of the weapons in the shops. Kuro scoffs. Of course, there wouldn't be a blade that surpasses him. Suka spots bread, pasta, and noodles as part of the citizens' regular diet, but he wonders if they have rice. A local overhears him talking about rice, and she directs him to Settle General Store. Suka arrives at a rather large building for a general store, and a small Katro runs up and greets him. He asks if they sell any rice, and she guides him further into the store. Kuro teases that Suka fell in love at first sight with a beastkin, a child one at that. Is there anything you want to tell us, Suka? Kuro remarks that if Suka really likes her that much, then there's a possibility to buy her, pointing out that a collar around her neck signifies that she is a slave. Suka is led into a large storehouse where several sacks of rice are stacked on top of each other. He spots a familiar Japanese grain of rice, while another seems to be a type of egg rice. He takes 10 sacks of each, and he pays 60,000 gold up front. Seidel, the owner of the store, personally comes down to thank Suka for his purchase. When Seidel learns that this is Suka's first time in the city, he asks if he'd rather have the rice transported to his inn or loaded on a wagon. Suka tells them that shipping won't be necessary. He lays his hands on the sacks of rice, and they are magically transported into his extra-dimensional inventory. Seeing that the possibilities are endless in selling to this customer, Seidel asks if he'd like to buy other items like seasoning cutlery and slaves. Suka perks up at the mention of slaves, and Seidel's lips curl into a wry smile. Would Suka happen to be interested in slaves? He asks. Suka acts shy and bashful about it, so Seidel puts his arm around his shoulder and ushers him into another room. Here, several demi-humans of all kinds of races are kept as merchandise behind thick, arrow-proof, and magic-proof glass. Unlike the slaves that Suka is familiar with, slaves also have their own set of rights and are protected by law. In a way, they are like maids and servants with a more stringent set of limitations. Seidel shows him to a darker part of his slave pens. This area is filled with criminal slaves, slaves that aren't normally shown to the public. Unlike the more official slaves from the previous room, these slaves don't have rights. As a result, their quality as workers dwindles since many of them are thieves and murderers first. He points at a girl with lifeless eyes and explains that she just arrived here today. She was previously working as a regular slave at a nobleman's home, but when their child was killed, she was blamed for the crime. Suka asks him if he thinks the girl was the culprit, but Seidel has no clue. Though he was good friends with the girl's father, he passed away 2 years ago. He always thought of the girl as kind-hearted and compassionate, but her personality has changed drastically ever since she was accused of murder. Somehow, Suka sees himself in this girl. Sadal asks Suka if he'd be kind enough to buy the girl Kana. Suka would rather not involve someone else in his plans for revenge, so he turns down his offer. Sadal starts sweating bullets, and he tells Suka that if he doesn't buy Kana now, then she will surely be executed. Suddenly, a rather unruly customer, Doc, bursts into the room, demanding to buy Kana. Sadal explains to Doc that there might be a bit of a problem, and he glances towards Suka. Doc claims that he is more important than whoever this Kirito Wanadi is, but Suka suddenly bids 100 million gold to buy Kana. Doc is insulted that someone would cut him off like this, and he grabs Suka by the collar. Though this would have intimidated any other lesser man, Suka is not one of them. Sadal begs Doc not to cause a scene, and Doc begrudgingly leaves. However, he promises not to forget this incident. Kuro asks why Suka bought the girl even though he claimed he didn't want to involve anyone else in revenge. The explanation is simple. Suka has decided to destroy anyone who displeases him. He spent 100 million gold on a slave just to spite some uppity noble brat. Sadal is grateful to Suka, and he promises to repay this debt someday. As Sadal watches Suka walk away, he realizes that even with his high-class merchant appraisal ability, he cannot completely discern Suka's true abilities. He is confident that Suka is strong enough to protect Kana and ensure that she has a bright and exciting future ahead of her. Suka returns to the inn with his purchase. Unfortunately, he spent all his money buying Kana, and he complains that Sadal didn't even give him a discount for doing him a favor by buying her. He had planned to leave the city as soon as he had prepared everything he needed, but his plans have changed. He glances at the sleeping Kana, and he lets her sleep a little while longer. Later, Kana begins cooking using his latent ability and not his skills. He prepares healing medicinal food for Kana, and he encourages her to eat. Kana crawls up to the plate on the floor, and she starts eating with her bare hands. Horrified by what he sees, Suka snatches the plate away from her. She explains that slaves are meant to eat on the floor, but Suka makes it clear that he isn't like other slave masters. He sets the plate on the table, and he asks her to eat with proper utensils. Kana silently does as she is told, and Suka observes that there is a certain elegance to the way she eats. He asks her if she likes how the food tastes, but she doesn't respond. Suka knows that his medicinal food can work on wounds of the body, but he wonders if it also works on wounds of the mind. He looks at Kana again, and he sees a tear roll down her cheek. A moment later, she drops her knife and starts sobbing uncontrollably. Kuro tells Suka that his food has healed her inner scars, but she must still deal with the pain of reconciliation. Suka looks at the photos of Kana that Sadal gave him, and he wonders what on earth happened to such a sweet and happy girl. Suka focuses all his rage and hatred toward the nobles, whom he holds responsible for his and Kana's suffering. Kuro warns Suka that they have some uninvited guests. Suka sensed them from a mile away. He isn't worried. They're just third-rate assassins with fourth-rate presence concealment. One of the assassins overhears one of his comrades suddenly cry out in pain. When he goes to check on him, he sees his corpse, but he sees Suka too late. He lashes out at him, but Suka easily avoids his wild strikes. Suka simply knocks the dagger out of his hand and kicks him into a wall. He asks the assassin who sent them, and when the assassin doesn't answer, Suka releases a pulse of his pressure, which causes the ground beneath them and a few nearby crates to erupt. Suka asks the assassin again, politely, who sent him, believing that the kingdom is trying to kill him to tie up loose ends. The assassin looks at him funny. Not everything is about you, Suka. He explains that they were hired to kill Kana, not him. He doesn't even know who he is. Suka knocks the assassin unconscious with a neck chop, and he dons his bare hood again. Kuro asks him if he wants to investigate what's happening, but Suka already has a good guess at what's going on. It looks like he'll need to leave the city sooner than expected. It seems that he's found himself in quite a troublesome predicament. Kana wakes up as the morning sun shines through her window. Today is the dawn of Suka's revenge. Suka uses his equivalent exchange skill to swap out his intuition for clean. He uses it to wash the dirt off his cloak, which he plans to have Kana wear later. While watching over her peaceful slumber, he remarks that her night terrors seem to have stopped. For now, he decides to prepare her some breakfast. In a flashback, Kana is taken in by the relatives of her ward Dulce after the passing of her father, and they promise to take her in. Kana is glad to be working alongside such wonderful people. But if they were so wonderful, how did it come to this? One afternoon, while cleaning outside the mansion walls, Kana discovers a lone flower growing from the pavement. Worried that it might be removed by the groundskeeper, she decides to replant it outside her room. However, before she can gather the proper gardening tools, one of the servant slaves alerts her that Dulce has been attacked by an unknown assailant. Kana races back inside the mansion grounds and discovers a badly injured Dulce bleeding on the floor. She desperately tries all the healing spells in her arsenal to try and stabilize his condition, but to no avail. His wounds are far too deep and numerous for the bleeding to stop. When she is discovered by Doc and the other servant from earlier, they immediately accuse her of being the culprit. She is placed under arrest for the murder of Dulce, and she quickly realizes that the masters of the house have conspired against her. She is used as a scapegoat to quietly eliminate the young master Dulce, so that they may steal his inheritance, title, and properties all for themselves. Kana is thrown into the extra bad slave markets, where they are treated more closely than true slaves. When she is given her first serving of food, she nearly gags. It looks and smells like vomit, and she hesitates to eat it. When her cellmate notices she is reluctant to eat, she snatches it out of her hand. She warns Kana that they will soon be sold off to some faraway mines, where the master will treat her however they want. Kana curls up into a ball. Why did this happen to her? Why did this happen? If Dulce were here, then she wouldn't be in this situation. It is all unfair. Suddenly, light. She sees a hand being offered to her, looks up, and guesses that this must be her new master. She is clothed, fed properly on a table, and taken care of. She doesn't remember the last time she ate edible food. Though she isn't hungry, she has no choice but to obey Shuka's order to eat. However, the moment she takes a bite of the food, she is overcome by an emotion she cannot put into words. Her very soul was moved by the love that went into the dish. While staring at her utensils, she recalls a memory of Dulce, in his final moments, comforting her of all people. Unable to contain herself any further, she cries. Kana reawakens in bed. Suka is eating what food he can put together with the little funds he has left, and he fears that he'll struggle to cover his lodging expenses at this rate. Suka notices Kana awake. She walks over to him and says that she's hungry. Kana goes through plate after plate of fried rice, even though Shuka has already made roughly 6 pots worth of it. He wonders if Kana is even human, but since she looks healthier than before, he can hardly complain. He asks her if she thinks it's good, and with a wide smile, she says yes. Her sudden cheerfulness and emotion catch Shuka completely off guard. It's like she's a completely different person. Kana suddenly falls to the ground, and Shuka fears the worst. He rushes to her side, afraid that she might have had an allergic reaction. But thankfully, Kuro informs him that she just fell asleep. Shuka cooks Kana a breakfast consisting of pizza toast, an egg sandwich, a Caesar salad, and some grapefruit yogurt. Suka is glad that she is feeling better, and she exclaims that it feels like her whole slave phase never happened. She accidentally spills some food on her dress, and she panics. She promises to clean it at a water well, but he tells her that people might find this weird. She reassures him that it doesn't matter since she is a slave, but he tells her not to bother. With a wave of his hand, he cleans her entire dress. No muss, no fuss. Kana is fascinated by how clean her clothes are, even her hair is back to being silky smooth. Suka also hands her a new set of underwear to change into since she didn't seem to have one on before. She is curious about where these undergarments hail from, and with no clear answer to give her, Shuka simply says that they are from a land called Japan. Kana's never heard of this country before. Kana suddenly remembers the reports that there was a lone hero whom nobody wanted, and she begins to piece the puzzle together. Shuka finally introduces himself to Kana, which confirms her suspicions that he was the same hero that was abandoned. She realizes that he is being nice to her precisely because they were both thrown away by the world like used wash rags. Kana is pleased to meet him, and she pledges undying loyalty to Suka. The pair head out into the city, and Kana gives Suka a grand tour of the area. She shows him various landmarks, including a bakery, a bookstore, a park, a Korean internet cafe, and several restaurants. Lastly, she takes him to a weapons shop, which she explains is run by an old friend of her father's. She urges him to go inside and take a look, but Suka turns her down. Kana can clearly see that his sword appears fairly weak and brittle, but only because Suka is purposefully causing it to appear low-leveled. Instead, he tells Kana that he doesn't have any money, and while they were going around the city, he was wondering what kind of business he should run. Since Suka's main talent is being a chef, he proposes that he could make a living by being one. Kana discourages this career option since the city center is already littered with established restaurants that possess a loyal clientele. Suddenly, Kuro telepathically warns Suka that they are being followed by strange men. Though they don't feel hostile now, he advises Suka to leave. Suka asks Kana where Seidel's shop is, and she leads him right to it. Strangely, it appears that Kana has no memory of this shop, as she has lost all memories between her imprisonment and this morning. When the beastkin servant sees Suka and Kana, she immediately runs off to call Seidel. Seidel is overjoyed to see Kana back to her old self again, and he tightly embraces her. He asks Suka if there is anything he can do to repay him for bringing Kana back, and he says that he's here to ask for a favor. Suka presents Seidel with a few sample rice balls as a Shark Tank pitch to start up an Oriental-style restaurant/diner. However, just like Kana, Seidel isn't confident that such a restaurant would take off. To begin with, rice isn't a popular food, and the town is already filled with established diners. Suka takes all these objections in stride, but he convinces Seidel to at least appraise the food first before coming to a decision. Seidel inspects the food, and he discovers that each and every one of them has a buff bonus. Realizing how lucrative this could be, he offers Suka the use of his store to sell them. Seidel can already see the safe room filled with gold coins he'll jump into. However, as soon as they leave, they are stopped by two guards, Rotten and Goliath. They ask Suka if he'd be willing to come with them, but when he insists on taking Kana with him, they warn that some bad memories might be triggered. They are brought back to the local lord's mansion, where several maids flash scornful looks at Kana. Suka holds her hand even tighter. They are brought into a reception room, where they meet Dengaro and his daughter, Altelias. Kana and Altelias have a rather polite reunion, especially compared to the maids from earlier. Altelias personally thanks Suka for rescuing her carriage from the brigands the other day, and Dengaro takes it upon himself to reward him. He has a few maids bring in 2 rewards, a bag filled with 10 million gold, and a short sword with his family crest, which will ensure his safe passage anywhere within the country. The reason why Dengaro is offering such a staggeringly high reward is because he wants Suka to hand over Kana to him, the woman whom he believes killed Dulce. Or rather, that's how the story goes. Kana was only arrested because all the evidence was circumstantial and there was nobody to corroborate her alibi. That is why Dengaro used his influence to change the sentence from execution to enslavement and had him transferred over to his friend Seidel. Everyone in the room firmly believes in Kana's innocence. Dengaro's request is simple. He asks Suka to find the real culprit behind his son's murder.